Picking up where we left off, we're still going to be using this same pen, the basic rows and columns pen. It's just a new video. We talked about how to do rows before, so that because that is the default behavior, and in some ways it's the most, I think it's the easiest to understand. But now we're going to talk a little bit also about columns. So if you come down to the CSS area where we've got our flex rules and you see this thing that says vertical stacking columns, then what we're going to do is make a new class. Let's make one for column. So, all right, and you'll notice, and I'm not making one that's called columns with an S. It's column. All right, and so because the other one that we made was row singular, so we'll just do column and be consistent. And the next thing that I want to do is up in the up in the HTML, I want to change the class from row to column. And you're going to notice that this jumps back to its original from when we started because there are no styles yet for column, right? And everything that we had made so far was associated with the row class, right? And so when we take that row class off, it no longer exists as a set of styles for that section. And that is actually the beauty of it, is that you can have, content all over the page that you could apply, these classes to, so that you can get the same behaviors. All right, so anyway, so the way that column works is very similar to row. So the first thing you would do is you would say display, and you say flex, and remember, as soon as I do that, just remember that it's behaving the same way because the default behavior for DisplayFlex is to display as a row, and we haven't told it to be something else. So here we need to be explicit because we don't want it to act like a row. We want it to act like a column. So we need to say flex direction, flex dash direction, and then we're going to say column, like that, and then it goes back to looking like this. And you might go, wait, that's exactly how it looked before. Well, that's because it isn't exactly the same. It actually isn't display block, it's DisplayFlex, which means that all of that container's children are going to behave in a flexible way. So now we could put other kinds of properties on here that are flex related, and these things will take a different effect. So the next thing that I could do to make it so, excuse me, to make it so that something looks different, like you can actually see the benefit of this and the effect of it, is that I can take a look at how this is, displaying, and you see here that that right now it just takes up as much room as is necessary. So one of the things I can do is set a fixed height for this container, right? This column container, and let's just say that it's, I don't know, like 100 viewport height, like that. All right, and so far it still looks the same, but if I were to change this, the wrapping behavior, because right now remember it's set to no wrap, and that means it'll just take up the space that it needs to take up. I can set the wrap. Oops, it needs to be flex wrap. Okay, and let's choose that flex wrap, and let's set that to actually wrap. Okay. And so now you can see the column behavior. It's acting differently because we set a fixed height, right? And so because I set a fixed height, it gets to the end of that fixed height and it says, hey, I can't keep going, therefore I'm going to wrap, and that means that it's going to jump up to the next column, right? So it's creating these columns. And so you can start to see how that works. Like if we wanted to change this then to 90 VH, you can see that you start to get these more and more columns. I could do 80 and so on, and you can just see how it keeps wrapping. And so you can, I think, probably see the benefit of how that would work. And so that's kind of the difference between the columns and the rows. And then if I wanted to set a fixed width to the divs inside of the column, I can do the same thing, kind of like what we did before, where I say, oops, gotta spell it right, where I say column div, so any instance of a div inside of that column container could then be something like, let's say that the width is like, I don't know, 20%, something like that. All right, and then you can see that it will limit that to 20%. And if I give it a greater height, then, and you might ask, well, wait a second, why isn't it wrapping sooner? Well, it doesn't have to, because remember, this is what's important. The column direction flow is based on the height, not the width, right? So it's based on the height of the box. So let's just go back as a reminder and let's put a border around the parent element. All right, so we'll say border 1 pixel solid and black or something. All right, and then if you remember, see, it gets down to the bottom, it says, hey, boom, I need to wrap, right? I need to go up here. And so because it's automatically, the width of the column is automatically going to take up 100% of its available space, all I'm doing is limiting the width of the interior items, right? The interior items being those divs. And it's not telling me that I have to make them grow or stretch or anything like that. If I were to take this off, right, if I did that, then it would automatically fill the space as necessary, right? So that's, I think that's something that's important to understand. And if, you know, if I had limited, let's say that I limited this even more, let's say to like 50, you can see that then it puts it into thirds, right? So that's something that's important. So like you wouldn't, for instance, let's go back to having it at 80 again. If I change this down here, let's uncomment the width on the items. If I told these instead, like, because this might be your assumption, you might say on the column type, you might assume, oh, I can do 33.333 whatever percent, and you might think that that's going to put it in thirds. Well, it's not, because it's that was the old assumption whenever you're doing stuff that is based off of rows, because remember, then you're doing, everything is counting across from left to right, right? It's going 1, 2, 3 from left to right, whereas the columns are counting downwards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever, vertically, before it hits that bottom, and the bottom is determined by this height that we set on the container, right? And so this assumption is not necessarily correct, where you know, you can set the item, like the div width, and it's going to automatically fill that space, because as a reminder, one more time to reiterate, it's going to run the column down to the bottom of that, and then it's going to start a new one, and it doesn't try to fill it up separately unless I take this off. And then in that case, it does try to fill it up and just make the space fill properly. So that's where I would say, oh, okay, well, if I want it to be in thirds, then I need to, then I would need to like limit this down to like 50 VH. But the problem is though, is then if I come in scale from different directions, then you see that it actually will change it, right? So it's thirds there, but, and it's thirds there, but not there, right? Because we start running out of room, and so it starts to reflow differently. So you can't, you have to be careful when you're using relative units of measure to make these determinations. If you really need something to be perfectly fixed in a certain way, you're either going to have to do it with relative units and media queries, or you're going to have to use truly absolute units like pixels or something like that, right? Where you can tell it exactly how many pixels to be wide, and then how many, you know, then you could actually give each of these things a width, and you wouldn't have to worry about it. And so anyway, but that's one of the complications of using the columns, I think, is that it does kind of flip the script a little bit with the way that you might be accustomed to thinking about reflow and using units of measure that are relative in the way that things wrap and stuff, and based on width traditionally versus, in this case, the way that things wrap based on height. So anyway, but that's an introduction really quickly to you know, how you can use columns and rows for Flexbox. That just sort of basic stuff. In the next tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can go ahead and fork off of this and move into something that's a little bit more complex, where we talk about how you can identify objects to style them inside of the container, the Flex container, so that you don't have to necessarily know exactly what the name of the element is. For instance, instead of knowing that this is called a div the way that we do here, you know, you can figure out how to style things based on pseudo selectors that are a little bit more variable.